Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Welcome to episode 5 of Witches of Scotland. This week we have part 2 of Professor Julian Goodare's chat with us. But before we start, we want to thank a couple of people who got in contact this week. Firstly, we'd like to thank Fiona Musk, who used to be the archivist at Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire Archives, who got in touch to send us links to transcripts of documents relating to the Aberdeen witchcraft trials of 1596 and 1597. We're reading through the fascinating papers. We also want to give a shout out to those who helped getting the podcast up and running, most especially Claire's brother David Mitchell, who is our fantastic sound engineer.
And Zoe's son Luca, who has composed the great music for us for the show. We've also decided that each week what we should do is pick out the names of a couple of women from different parts of Scotland who were accused, convicted and executed as witches. Unfortunately, we don't know much about them other than their names, but we thought it might be a good idea to remember the women that we are talking about.
I think it's really important that we think about the women and the men who were executed and who went through this absolute horror. We think of them as individual people because there was round about 2,500 that were executed. And I think it's important that as far as we can, we try and think of them as separate people. So who are the people you've come up with this week to have a look at?
So I've looked at 3 different people, and as I say, we've got very little information on them, Zoe. The first one is Beatrix Leslie. She was a woman from Dalkeith. We know that she was a widow and she was tried, convicted. She went to trial at the High Court of Justiciary on the 3rd of August 1661. That is, I think, all that we have recorded about her.
Wow, that's amazing. The second person that you've come up with is Nick Neving. She was one of the earliest recorded, is that right?
It's noted that she was executed as a witch in 1563, and the reason I looked that one up was that was the year that the Witchcraft Act came into force. So they weren't hanging about when the Witchcraft Act came into force. People were being accused and going through trial and being convicted that very year. And the only other thing we know about Nick Neving as one of the earliest recorded people convicted of witchcraft was that she was unmarried. That was the other thing that was noted. But it's funny that the things that they noted about people were their names, where the trial was, and whether or not they were married. It's a strange only factor that's considered important about them.
I don't think that is strange, because I'd be really interested to see a breakdown. I know it's not possible to have a complete breakdown of this because of the scant records, but I'd like to have a breakdown of how many women were executed that were married. You know, how many of these women were in fact without a man by their side and therefore possibly seen as suspicious or dangerous or weird or, you know, something that marked them out as being separate.
Even as well, just not having some support in the community, you know, not having a man to speak for you, I suppose, would be a vulnerability.
Absolutely, because if you didn't have anybody to stand by you, I mean, who's going to stick up for you? Because we've already talked about the absolute the climate of fear that there must have been, that if you were then, you know, to mark yourself out as somebody that was friendly with somebody that had been accused as a witch, did that mean that you were then going to get brought into it as well? So
that's actually something quite important about the Witchcraft Act, and we maybe should do a podcast or part of a podcast about the actual words of the Act itself and what it actually meant.
Do you know any legal experts that we could get into?
I might know one or two legal experts, not too far from
Marvellous, so that would be handy.
But to pick up on what you just said there, what's interesting was that you could be convicted under the Witchcraft Act and executed not only if you were a witch, but if you'd gone to a witch for help. So coming to the aid of somebody who was accused of being a witch and saying, I don't think she's a witch, is my friend, would be placing you closer to that person and obviously nearer to the suspicion to start that you would somehow be obliged to that person or beholden to them because they'd helped you or something. So it was really, really dangerous to come to anybody's help.
They must have been so isolated and shunned. It's just absolutely horrific, really horrific.
Yeah.
And the third woman that we've got for this week, she was also a widow, wasn't she?
She was indeed. Agnes Henry from Curis. I thought it was a good idea to pick someone from Curis because of the fact that we've already spoken about the Torryburn witch Lilith Adey, and we've actually been to Curis. We went down there to see the witches' trail there.
That was very interesting, and there's a very active community there that have been pushing for memorial for a long time.
Yeah, we're hopefully going to get Councillor Kate Stewart on in a future episode to talk about that. She is part of Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland, and it would be really great to hear a bit from them.
Absolutely, yeah, that'd be great.
What we know about Agnes Henry, just the full details, is that she was, again, a widow who went to trial on the 9th of July, 1675. She was one of 4 in that year that I could find on the list that were from Curis who went to trial and were convicted. I mean, you know the size of Curis, that's the place where parts of Outlander are filmed. It's tiny. And the idea that in 1 year 4 women would be convicted and executed as witches is very scary. In fact, I think the total number is 32 women in total in that area that were convicted, in just such a very, very small place.
Another thing that stands out to me about it is that the dates that we've got here for them, the 3rd of August for Beatrix Leslie and the 9th of July for Agnes Henry. Now, this might seem like a silly point, and again, this could be because I'm a reader and a writer and I'm really interested in sort of settings and that kind of thing. But I'm surprised that it's summer that happened. You know, I think there's part of me that kind of had this notion that it was like a long and hard winter and that these things occurred and people went a bit kind of mad over the winter or whatever. Yeah. That seems even wilder to me that it was the summer. Now, some people might think that's a bit daft, but I just sort of think, well, weren't they sort of busy with other more pleasant things?
No, I don't think they were. I think, as Julian said to us in the last episode, they were absolutely focused on weeding out the devil amongst them.
It's wild.
And that would not go away because it was a sunny day.
Talking about Julian, we go on to our talk with the professor that we left last week on a cliffhanger, where Claire asked Julian,
why Scotland? Why out of the whole of Europe did we surpass every other country in looking for and finding witches? And Julian gave us a very interesting answer.
Scotland is still just a sort of case study of a European phenomenon, and belief in witchcraft is a pan-European thing. I have to begin this by talking about things that you would find anywhere in Europe. I suppose the 2 things that you need to think about are, firstly, the beliefs of the common people and the practices of the common people, their magical beliefs, and their idea that people could harm someone else by magical means. There are magical practitioners in the early modern period who cure people, foretell the future, find lost or stolen goods, conduct love magic to try and get somebody to acquire a partner or reacquire a partner. There's various types of services that these people provide, and it's not all straightforwardly magic, and they probably won't use the word magic, but nevertheless, sort of rituals and sort of verbal charms that we would regard as magical are their stock in trade. So they legitimate magic on a sort of everyday level. And, if you can have good magic, you can have bad magic. These magical practitioners, on the whole, are not the witches, if you see what I mean. Some of them are. You could imagine a sort of Venn diagram, a circle of magical practitioners, circle of witches. There'll be some overlap, but not very much. And some of the magical practitioners will also be involved in witchcraft, not as being accused, but as actually identifying witches or detecting witches as part of their healing practice. They may well suggest that their clan has been bewitched.
That someone has put a spell on them, and what they were doing is they were healing them with their magic.
Conducting sort of anti-witchcraft practice. So these kinds of discourses feed into village beliefs. And then we have actual quarrels and curses. And probably the single most common time when somebody will believe that somebody else is a witch is if you have a quarrel with that person and then something bad happens to you. You think, why did that bad thing happen to me? Well, could it be that that person I had a quarrel with is getting their revenge by magic? And in the trial records, we see time and again neighbours testifying that they had a quarrel with so-and-so and then this bad thing happened to them.
So the easiest attribution in its earliest days is you have become sick. You might go to a person to help you get better with magic. Now, those persons, men, women, equally split, usually a woman?
I think it's about 2/3 women.
Okay, so 2/3 women. So you'd probably go to see a woman and they would heal you with magic, but suggest that maybe bad magic had been used upon you.
Yeah, it's not their everyday stock in trade. They won't be diagnosing bewitchment every day, but from time to time. Or you could work it out yourself. You don't have to go to a magical practitioner. You can simply think, I had that screaming row with old Mrs. So-and-so, and she cursed me.
And then something happened. I got sick.
And then
my family got sick. There was a fire. Yeah. From those sorts of early starts, what then made Scotland wholeheartedly adopt witchcraft, legitimising it in the sense that people believed it happened, but also bringing the Witchcraft Act into place, which meant the execution of people?
Right, that is a very good question that follows on from that, because these sort of village neighbourly interactions, as far as we can tell, they've been going on for centuries. They don't start in the 16th century when witchcraft executions start.
People have been falling out with one another for centuries. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, that's right. And the default thing for them to do is to go to the supposed witch and try and negotiate a reconciliation. We see those time and again in the documents. The stories that these neighbours tell is, I had a quarrel with so-and-so, and then I became ill, or my cattle became ill, or whatever. And then I went to her and tried to sort it out, and we had a drink together, and I got better.
Well, that would have been nice if that's the way the story of witchcraft ended, but sadly not.
Yeah. The reason those stories were written down is then something else happened to somebody else, or things got worse, and the person gets caught up in the legal system for some other reason, and then inquiries are made and all these stories come out. That's why those stories were written down. These quarrels, accusations of bewitchment, reconciliations, they have been happening for centuries beforehand, and they continue to happen after executions had stopped.
Yeah, they continue to happen now.
Yeah. I mean, Owen Davies is the scholar who's looked at this most. I think says that they have largely stopped in Britain. I mean, I think he hasn't found any cases in late 20th century Britain, but they are the norm in the witch hunting period. So, the common folk believe in witchcraft in the sense that they believe that there are people who can work harmful magic. So, witchcraft is a bad thing. There are no good witches, right? That's a sort of background factor. It's essential, it's vital, we see it in many, many cases, but it's not what causes the panics. It's not what causes the criminal justice system to become involved. And what happens there is, as you say, it's the Witchcraft Act, it is the authorities, and it is the elite educated idea of witchcraft, which is the idea that somebody has sold their soul to the devil. And the devil is the sort of driving force of it in their minds. And the intellectual idea of a witch arose in the 15th century. It's constructed from a number of things, but the idea that there is a sect of people, many of whom are women, who secretly worship the devil. This is something that various inquisitors and people trying to deal with heresy start to convince themselves that this sect exists, and various treatises are written about it. It starts to become persuasive, and you then start interrogating people and asking them if they're members of this sect. And, if you interrogate even a few people under torture, you start to get evidence.
Surprisingly, people start confessing to things you want them to confess them to when you're torturing them.
Yeah. I'm afraid it's in some ways as simple as that. But this then sort of fits in with the belief systems. And in the 16th century, we have the Protestant Reformation, a huge political and religious movement challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. And in Catholic countries, you have what historians call the counter-reformation, which is a movement within Catholic countries to reassert Catholic orthodoxy and to prove that they're right and the Protestants are wrong, and to enforce Catholic orthodoxy on the population. And these two clashing religions, each of them is trying to prove that they're more godly than the other. Each of them is trying to spread correct Christianity to the population. They're aware that the population doesn't have the details of correct belief. The Protestants, particularly, because it's completely well understood by them that the Catholic Church has led people astray for centuries, but we now have the correct faith, so we now have to spread it to the people. So they're not surprised when they find that people have the wrong beliefs.
Were both groups vying to be more godly then? Was that part of the reason behind this, that they were trying to prove that they were the ones that were able to identify or flush out the witches? Is that?
Yes, and if they can deal with witches, that proves that they're on God's side, because this really is God versus.
So the more witches they found, the more godly they were.
Yes, I mean they're not running numbers to say let's see how godly we are this week, but in a nutshell, yes, that's right, and. They can even say to themselves, the devil is attacking us particularly aggressively. And we find all these witches because the devil is so active in Scotland. Because of the success of the Reformation, this has stirred up the devil and made the devil more angry. And so no doubt it's upsetting that you find all these witches because they don't really want witchcraft. But the fact that they do find it and that they're dealing with it successfully sort of further validates their belief that they're correct, that the devil is out to get them. If the devil's out to get you, you must be right.
Was there a very literal view of the devil as being like a person, as being somebody who literally would be abroad? So they really did genuinely think women were dancing with the devil and so on, and slightly more intimate communication with the devil. They really did genuinely believe that.
Yes. Time and again in confessions, you get the details of how this witch met the devil and what she or he did when she or he met him. In a nutshell, a confession is a negotiation between the witchcraft suspect, who is mostly an uneducated member of the common folk with popular ideas about the devil, and the interrogator, who probably has many of the educated ideas of the elite. And so the educated elite tend to think more of a sort of spiritual devil, or a devil who is a tempter, the devil who is inside your head. And the common folk tend to think more of the devil as a sort of external force and as a black man.
One of the people that we've been speaking to already, Mary Kidd, told us about that example of the identifying a black man, the racism that was involved in it. Was that what it was?
We're not thinking about ethnic difference here. I'm still actually not sure what they mean by the black man. I don't think it's about clothing. It may be something to do with hair colour. One thing that the elite will certainly recognise about the devil is that he is a fallen angel, and as such, he is a spirit. So, there has had to be quite a lot of theological work to understand how a spirit can appear as a man. The spirit doesn't have a body.
Was there a lot of writing about that, explaining how that could come to be?
Yes, I mean, that's mostly been written about in the Middle Ages. This has already been established by the early modern period, but we're looking at people like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. But the Orthodox elite idea is that that's not a real person, and it's not a real body, and it's made of condensed air. The logical corollaries of that is because it's made of condensed air, it has no blood, and people in those days assume that body heat comes from the blood, and so that the body of the devil will be cold.
How interesting.
And many witches are asked about that.
So people were being tortured, and as people who like to extract confessions from people usually have, they've got a set idea about what they want to extract from them. Now, I understand that in Scotland, and I do want to come back to speak a wee bit more about how the whole thing particularly took off in Scotland, but I understand that in Scotland, one of the favoured way of extracting confessions was sleep deprivation. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what would happen was people would simply be denied sleep, and they would be asked questions by people wanting certain answers. So they would presumably be posing the questions like, was the devil cold? over and over again.
Yeah.
And then eventually the person will repeat back to them, I touched the devil, he was cold.
Yes, that's right. It's tricky because, of course, the interrogators have to convince themselves that that really is coming from the suspect themselves. And so they have to convince themselves that they haven't simply fed the suspect the answer. And I'm not an expert on modern interrogations, but, the little that I know does indicate that, in fact, interrogators can convince themselves that that really did come from the suspect. They don't realise how far they have led the interrogation.
Yes, well, there's all sorts of subtleties to interrogation and even to just conversations and asking people things, including voice intonation, body language, things that you wouldn't even pick up on. People being more keen when someone responds in a certain way than in another way, and just expressing that, which the person would be completely unaware of. Did they not realise that not allowing people to get sleep would make them go mad, start talking about devils, that kind of thing, if they were being interrogated about them?
I think their answer would be, don't look at it, works. Look, we got the results.
We got the results, so it must be working. But that was the favoured form of torture in Scotland. Is there any reason why we favoured that form of torture as opposed to the more physical forms that we hear about elsewhere?
Many jurisdictions are like Scotland. They don't record much about torture. They record the confession of the suspect, but they don't record the circumstances in which that confession is given. And, perhaps that's out of some kind of coyness or embarrassment. But to some extent, to some extent, it's about relevance. The means by which this confession were obtained are not relevant. What we want is the information that we've got. You can occasionally see leading questions in the records, and there's one confession. I should explain that very few confessions are recorded in question and answer form. Usually the questions are not recorded, and the whole thing is turned into a continuous third-person narrative. One suspect I can remember is asked about having had sex with the devil, and it said the devil was neither hot nor cold as she thought. Now, I do not find it plausible that you describe having had sex with the devil and then completely out of the blue add the information, and he was neither hot nor cold. That's a response to a question.
And just apropos of nothing, I'm giving you that small adminicle of evidence.
I suppose this went on and there were more executions. There'd be probably less of a need for physical torture because the fear of what was going to happen would be quite motivating, I'd imagine.
Yes, and certainly some continental jurisdictions where they do write these things down, they do it in two stages. They first of all show them the torture instruments and say, now would you like to confess? And some of them do at that point. So, we know very little about Scottish torture, so we don't have the documents that enable us to say that was done. If you don't confess, we will use means to extract a confession from you. But it's plausible to suggest that they were. And it's also worth remembering that in terms of the ethics of this procedure, there is the whole contest of God versus the devil in the background. There is an idea that God is involved in this and God will protect the innocent. God will not allow an innocent person to confess.
Interesting. So with God on your side, you couldn't really do wrong. That would be the idea. So you've explained to us about the history of witchcraft. You've explained to us why, the Witchcraft Act, obviously, that made a change to things in Scotland. We understand from our very minor researches that Zoe and I have done compared to what you know, that James VI had a significant impact on witchcraft and beliefs in Scotland. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So, I'm often asked about James VI and his role, and it's a question that it does need to be asked, and he does have an important role. I'm reluctant to attribute too much to him. Much of it, or all of it perhaps, would have happened without him. Certainly in the early stages, he is directly involved. And the first of the big panics, the so-called North Berwick Panic of 1991, which is sort of centred around an alleged gathering of witches in North Berwick Church, is about conspiracy against the king, or the story that comes out in interrogating these suspects is about conspiracy against the king, and he is personally involved in some of the interrogations. So this legitimizes and politicizes witchcraft prosecutions and gives them a higher profile. And that's just something that happens for a few years. The second panic of 1597, James is also involved in that, and he seems to have interrogated some of the witches in person again. The 1597 panic is much less well documented than the North Berwick one, so we know less about his role. But the legitimization that James gives to witchcraft prosecution is very hard to quantify. It probably is worth something. And James also writes a book about it called Demonology, which interestingly coins the word demonology. He's the first person to use that word, but various other writers use it then afterwards, which is a sort of introduction to witchcraft and the devil and the relationship between the witch and the devil and why witches need to be executed. So, James is an intellectual, and, he explains this in, reasonably sophisticated theological terms. He gives the appropriate biblical references and sort of unpacks it in a more or less logical way.
You've got the church and you've got the state. The church, I should say the churches, are keen to show how godly they are, to weed out the witches. Mm-hmm. You've also got the state in the form of the king. Is it the combination of those two things that made Scotland have higher numbers, or are there other factors as well?
Yes, no, that is the key thing that gives Scotland the high numbers. And I use the phrase the godly state because, the church is not simply something that happens on Sunday morning in a building. Religion is about the whole of people's lives on every day of the week. And, the king has to be godly too. The Privy Council has to be godly too. The king's foreign policy has to be godly too. And if it's not, the ministers will have a word with him. The king knows that, and the king, has bought into that. And one of the ideologies of this period is the idea of the divine right of kings. And that's another thing that James VI is notable for, is his promotion as a king and as an intellectual of the intellectual idea of the divine right of kings, which is that God has personally appointed the king. We still see this on the coinage, the letters DG on the coinage, Dei Gratia, by the grace of God. If that means anything, it means that God has appointed the present queen to rule. But, this really has political force in the early modern period, and preachers will emphasize that you must obey the king, you must obey the powers that be. And the powers that be is a phrase from Romans 13 in the New Testament. And, the obedience to the powers that be gets hammered home in sermon after sermon. And the king is in charge of that. And one of the things James says in his book is witches should and must be tried by the lawful godly authorities, by God's appointed magistrates, because he's been appointed by God. The judges in the courts have also been appointed by God, and they are the agents that can deal with this threat from the devil. So this is a contest between the devil and James and his government as divine rulers. So religion is in with the bricks of that ideology. So witches are tried not in the church courts, but in secular criminal courts, the ancestors of the High Court of Justiciary today. So it is the authority of the crown, the state, if you like, that is ordering their executions. But the courts of the church, the Kirk Sessions, the presbyteries, are also involved at a sort of lower level or at a preliminary level. They're often the ones identifying witches in the first place, conducting the interrogations, doing the torture. They may well have secular figures in aiding them, but the intensity of the Scottish witch hunt is linked to the intensity of the Scottish Reformation, where they have a Kirk Session in every parish, at least in the Lowlands. And so, as well as the minister, there is a dozen lay elders whose job it is to promote godliness. The Kirk Session does not just organise the coffee rota and the flower rota. It's a court. If you do something ungodly, you can be hauled in before the Kirk Session and interrogated, punished, made to do penance. It's mostly dealing with relatively minor offences. But if it finds a case of witchcraft, it will pass it up the line and get it dealt with. The intensity of the way in which the Kirk Session penetrates into the lives of the common folk, we don't see that everywhere in Europe. England, for example, does not have an equivalent institution. England is also Protestant, but, the English vestry, the committee that runs the parish church in England, isn't quite so active as a court as this Scottish Kirk Session. And the way in which people's lives are being affected by this And everyone is having to sign on the dotted line to this. Everyone is having to cooperate with this. Everyone is having to come to church from time to time, or at least not to do anything outrageous on the Sabbath. Everyone is having to learn the appropriate texts. And the more godly ministers will say, for instance, you can't get your baby baptized until you've learned the appropriate texts, the Ten Commandments, the Creed, the Catechism. Come back when you've learned them.
So people were really being policed in that way. I mean, there would be absolutely no possibility of someone popping up one day and saying, I just don't believe in God. That would just not be acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't really the intellectual apparatus for people to say, I don't believe in God. It's a sort of hypothetical construct, really. And all these people regard themselves as Christians, which is one of the reasons Margaret Murray was wrong, by the way.
That they didn't regard themselves as pagans, they did indeed regard themselves as Christians, yeah.
They regarded themselves as Christians. They'd never heard of any pagan gods. They certainly didn't worship the devil, and they certainly didn't worship any pagan gods. This is a world in which Christianity is a very active thing, and it is under threat from the devil. And there is sin around us, and the ministers are routinely denouncing all sorts of sins, and the Kirk session is punishing all sorts of sins. And so when you get these extremely serious sins of witchcraft, they want to deal with it, and it completely fits within a much broader picture. So, these pyres and these stakes that are burning people at the stake, they're a small part. They're the most dramatic and gruesome part. But they're a small part to the ministers of a much, much broader agenda, which is to make everyone into an active, godly Christian and to stamp out ungodliness. These people are sincere in what they're doing. They're terrifyingly
Yes. Well, I can imagine certainly that having that effect. I mean, it's an extraordinary picture you paint. I don't mean picture in the sense that it's not true, but it's an extraordinary way that we simply do not think of, I suppose, a religious experience in the modern world, that it pervades all part of your life. It's all seeing, it's controlling, it's your neighbour watching you, it's your person in the kirk telling you what to do. It sounds oppressive, and in those sorts of circumstances, you can truly imagine what it was to be called a witch and the terror of being called a witch.
Well, thanks for listening to episode 5. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and rate us because it helps us get the podcast heard more widely. If you'd like to join in, you can join the campaign by signing up to our website, witchesofscotland.com, and you can find links to Twitter, Instagram and Facebook on there too.